The 100-ton T-28 super heavy tank went down in U.S. military history for one reason above all else. It was unbelievably slow. Even with a full tank of gas and everything running perfectly, this thing moves slower than a person on foot. Think about that for a second, an armored vehicle that literally couldn't keep up with walking infantry. The engineers who built it went all in on thick armor and a massive gun, but basically forgot to check whether the engine could actually move all that weight. Because of those wild specs, the Army had absolutely no clue what to do with it. And eventually, and this part is almost too crazy to believe, the military straight up lost the prototype and spent almost 30 years trying to find it. These are real, documented facts from the story of the T-28 Super Heavy Tank, also known as the T-95. This 100-ton monster, loaded with insane armor, a huge gun, and a top speed of just 8 miles per hour, became one of the strangest and most fascinating projects in American tank history. The story starts in 1943, when Allied Command was planning the invasion of Western Europe. Staff officers knew that after landing, troops would push deep into the continent and eventually slam into a massive obstacle, the Siegfried Line, also called the West Wall. This giant network of fortifications stretched all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea and was one of the most extensive defensive systems ever built. Thousands of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth anti-tank barriers, minefields, and dug-in artillery positions created a defensive wall that was absolutely terrifying to go up against. Standard tanks of the era had a real chance of getting absolutely chewed up in front of those defenses, which would mean losing a ton of soldiers. That's when General Gladian Barnes from the Ordnance Department pitched a bold idea: build a completely new kind of vehicle, one designed from the ground up specifically to punch through heavily fortified lines. The project was called the Assault Tank, and the specs were wildly ambitious for the time. Barnes wanted to mount a high-powered 105mm anti-aircraft gun on it, designed to blow apart concrete bunkers with direct fire. The frontal armor was supposed to be 200 to 250 millimeters thick, enough to make the thing basically bulletproof against anything the enemy could throw at it. For the engine setup, he wanted to use an electric transmission originally developed for the T1 series of heavy tanks. But the most ambitious part was the timeline. Barnes wanted factories to crank out 25 of these machines within 8 to 12 months, specifically to use them in the European theater. The top brass heard him out, but they weren't buying it. Building a super heavy tank from scratch in that kind of time frame seemed almost impossible, even for American industry. On top of that, the electric transmission Barnes wanted was wildly unreliable and totally impractical for real battlefield conditions. In March 1944, Army Command made its call. Instead of 25 vehicles, they approved just 3 prototypes for testing. At the same time, engineers were told to ditch the unstable electric transmission and go with a standard mechanical one. General Barnes pushed back hard. He fired off a letter to leadership demanding they reconsider the order size. After a bunch of back and forth, they landed on a compromise: 5 units. The new vehicle got its official name, the T-28 Heavy Tank. The project was finally moving forward, but the military had absolutely no idea how tough the manufacturing side was going to be. Just finding a factory that could actually build something this massive turned out to be almost as hard as designing the vehicle in the first place. Most factories in the country just didn't have the right equipment or enough floor space to handle that kind of size and weight. It wasn't until July 1944 that Pacific Car and Foundry finally agreed to take on the contract. Even then, that plant couldn't produce the huge cast parts for the front of the hull, so engineers ordered those separately from General Steel Castings. While the engineers were still going back and forth on blueprints and specs, the war in Europe kept moving. Allied troops landed in Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed hard toward the German border. Meanwhile, the tank that was supposed to break through the Siegfried Line was still just drawings on paper. From the very start, this project was also plagued by naming confusion. And honestly, that confusion is still around today. A lot of military history fans are convinced the T-28 and the T-95 are two completely different vehicles. Some think the 2-track version is an early model and the 4-track version came later. Others assume it was actually a tank destroyer. In reality, it's the exact same vehicle. The US military just renamed it 3 times in less than 2 years, which honestly is kind of impressive in a bureaucratic sort of way. Originally, it was designated Heavy Tank T-28, and that's how it appeared in documents starting in March 1944. But in February 1945, the Chief of Ordnance raised a classification issue. He made a fair point. The vehicle didn't have a rotating turret, so technically it wasn't really a tank. After some debate, officials agreed, and a month later they approved a new name, 105mm gun motor carriage T-95. Seemed like the issue was settled, but just a year later that name didn't really fit either. Self-propelled guns back then were typically light and mobile, and a nearly 100-ton armored beast just didn't belong in that category. In June 1946, leadership gave it a final designation, Super Heavy Tank T-28. Basically, the vehicle got its own unique category because it simply didn't fit any existing one. While officials argued about what to call it, engineers were wrestling with the actual design, and this phase was just as chaotic. The requirements kept changing, sometimes in completely opposite directions, which must have driven the design team nuts. Initially, designers planned 250 millimeters of frontal armor. Then leadership cut it to 200 millimeters to save weight. Then the whole concept shifted again, and the final version ended up with a whopping 305 millimeters, thicker than anything on any production tank of that era. To put that in perspective, the German Tiger had just 100 millimeters of frontal armor. That's 3 times less. The weapon specs bounced around too. First, they planned to use a 105mm T-5 anti-aircraft gun, then swapped it for a lighter version, the T-5E1. This gun hit really hard and could take out concrete fortifications from a long way off. Chevrolet got the job of developing the gun mount. Their engineers faced a tough puzzle, how to fit a big gun into a low, turretless hull. In the end, they managed to give the gun limited aiming angles, 10 degrees of horizontal traverse, and -5 to +19 degrees of vertical elevation. For any target outside that arc, the crew had to turn the entire vehicle, which took a while given how slow this thing was. In August 1944, the team built a wooden mock-up. This let them check the overall layout and spot any spacing issues. Going back and forth on blueprints between the Ordnance Department and the Pacific Car Plant ate up months. Every detail had to be carefully approved, because changing anything in the base design meant redesigning everything around it. The massive cast piece for the front hull was a particularly tough challenge. General Steel Castings started making it in late 1944, but the first finished casting didn't reach the assembly plant until June 1945. The first hull was finished in August of that year. It had been about a year and a half since the project got the green light, which was actually pretty standard for building something this complex back then. But here's the problem. By the time the first super heavy tank was actually ready, the war in Europe was already over. Germany had surrendered back in May, and Allied forces had long since pushed past the Siegfried Line, the exact obstacle this whole vehicle was designed to break through. Just like that, the tank had lost its entire reason for existing. And just weeks after that first hull was completed, something happened that killed any remaining chance of mass production for good. In August 1945, Japan surrendered, ending World War II. Just like that, nobody needed new tanks anymore. Military leadership reviewed their orders and slashed the number of super heavy tanks from 5 to 2, the ones already in production. The other 3 were never built. The first fully assembled prototype shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in December 1945, and the second arrived in January 1946. The finished machine turned a lot of heads because it just looked so weird and was absolutely massive. The hull stretched over 36 feet long and more than 14 feet wide. But the real jaw-dropper was the weight. 95 tons fully loaded, with the external track modules bolted on. Those extra track modules were one of the vehicle's most distinctive and unusual features. Engineers knew that at this kind of weight, the tank would create way too much ground pressure on standard narrow tracks and simply sink into any soft ground. To fix that, they designed removable external track assemblies that attached to the sides of the hull. Each unit was basically a complete drive system with its own set of road wheels and drive sprockets. The result? 4 tracks instead of the usual 2, giving the vehicle much greater stability on soft and rough terrain. But there was a pretty big catch. With those extra modules on, the tank was too wide for rail transport or standard bridges. So the designers made the side assemblies detachable for hauling. Good idea in theory. In practice, it took the crew 2 to 4 hours to remove or install the outer tracks, and that was with specialized gear and a prepped site. Once detached, the tank towed the modules behind it on a rigid hitch, basically dragging them along like trailers. Now let's talk armor, because this thing was on a completely different level from anything else out there at the time. The upper front plate was 305 millimeters thick. No anti-tank gun of the era could get through it. The gun mantlet was nearly as thick at 292 millimeters. The side plates near the front hit 216 millimeters, and the lower front plate had 140 millimeters. The upper hull sides featured 64 millimeters of armor, angled at almost 60 degrees, and that slope massively boosted its shell resistance. Even the outer track modules had their own armor, 102 millimeters on the sides and 76 millimeters up front. For perspective, the German Tiger's frontal armor was 100 millimeters, meaning the side armor on the T-28's outer tracks was actually better protected than the front of a Tiger. The main weapon was a 105 millimeter T-5E1 gun, and ballistically speaking, this thing was a beast. Its armor-piercing rounds left the barrel at over 900 meters per second, easily shredding fortifications at direct fire range. The crew carried 62 rounds in special stowage racks inside the fighting compartment. The only secondary weapon was a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the commander's cupola for dealing with infantry and aircraft. It took 4 guys to run this thing: a driver, a commander, a gunner, and a loader. The inside was super cramped, barely enough room to do your job. Since there was no rotating turret, all 4 crew members were housed in a single hull space without a full 360-degree view of their surroundings. To aim the gun at anything outside its very narrow horizontal arc, the driver literally had to turn the whole vehicle, a slow and awkward process. That one design choice basically shaped everything about how this vehicle could fight and move. Under the hood was a 500 horsepower Ford gas engine, the same exact motor they put in the M26 Pershing, which was a heavy tank that weighed about half as much. So you're looking at about 5 horsepower per ton, which is laughably low, and you could feel it. Top speed on a road maxed out at about 8 miles per hour, and off-road it was even worse. A soldier walking at a fast pace could literally outrun this thing without breaking a sweat. With full fuel tanks, roughly 400 gallons, the vehicle had an operational range of about 100 miles. Testing kicked off at Aberdeen in January 1946, and the problems showed up almost immediately. The engine was running at its absolute limit the entire time, constantly overheating and needing frequent stops just to cool down. Mechanics kept running into small problems left and right, but nothing catastrophic, mostly because the engineers were smart enough to use tried and tested parts from other vehicles. The transmission, suspension, and chassis mostly did their jobs well enough, but the engine simply couldn't deliver enough power for the enormous load it was hauling. Over the entire testing period, the tank covered roughly 540 miles total. Because the vehicle was so painfully slow, it took the crew several months just to rack up that distance. Long stints on the test track demanded intense focus and concentration from both the crew and the observers watching from the sidelines. The vehicle crawled along with the engine straining hard under the load, carving deep ruts into even fairly hard ground. Turning required a huge amount of space and took an absurd amount of time. Every hill became a major ordeal, with the tank barely cresting the top on the very edge of stalling out completely. But the live fire tests told a completely different and much more encouraging story. The gun was impressively accurate and hit hard, proving the engineers got their math right. Armor-piercing rounds tore through simulated concrete bunkers and armor plates at the expected ranges. Testers loved the high muzzle velocity and flat trajectory, which meant gunners could land accurate shots from really far out. In their final report, they actually recommended using this gun on future tanks, and that's exactly what ended up happening. The armor testing was equally impressive. Out on the proving ground, specialists shot at the tank with 88mm guns, the standard weapon found on heavy tanks and tank destroyers of the era, known for their excellent ballistics and capable of knocking out most armored vehicles at the time. Yet the prototype's frontal armor shrugged off every single hit without taking critical damage. The rounds left dents and gouges on the surface, but not one of them managed to punch through the 300mm barrier. So the takeaway was clear. If all you cared about was protection, the super heavy tank concept actually worked. Meanwhile, the second prototype was hauled a considerable distance, first to Fort Knox and then out to Yuma Proving Ground in the Arizona desert. The climate there was ideal for testing hardware in extreme heat and harsh conditions. The area also featured specialized proving grounds where military engineers tested pontoon bridges and river crossing equipment. The whole point was to find out whether existing floating bridges could handle something that weighed close to 100 tons. The answer, unfortunately, was no. Most standard crossing equipment simply couldn't handle that kind of weight, which would be a huge problem if they ever wanted to actually use this thing in a real war. In 1947, the second prototype had a serious accident. During a routine test run, the engine caught fire, and flames quickly spread through the entire engine compartment. The crew managed to get out safely, but there was nothing they could do to stop the blaze. The fire completely destroyed the power plant and wrecked the internal system so badly that the evaluation board basically said it's not worth fixing. They wrote it off and sent it to the scrapyard. Just like that, the program lost half its prototypes, and everything now depended on the single surviving unit at Aberdeen. In October of that year, the testing board submitted its final report. The bottom line: the vehicle was just too unreliable and way too slow. The tank was too slow, too heavy, and too hard to operate for any real combat use. Only the main gun got praise, which really did perform great in testing. But a great gun alone wasn't enough to save the project. That same month, just as the board was wrapping up the super heavy tank program, the first unit of a brand new vehicle rolled into Aberdeen for evaluation. Engineers introduced the T-29 heavy tank, which took a completely different design approach. Instead of a turretless layout, the T-29 had a fully rotating turret, the way most people expect a tank to look. It carried the exact same 105mm gun as the T-28. The T-29 had significantly thinner armor, but it was far more maneuverable and much more practical to actually operate in the field. And the generals liked that trade-off way more. In October 1947, the military officially shut down the super heavy tank program for good. They didn't scrap the surviving prototype, though. Instead, they kept it around and used its massive weight to load test bridges and road surfaces. So, a vehicle that was originally built to smash through some of the toughest fortifications in the world ended up as a glorified paperweight. After the program was canceled, the lone surviving prototype sat at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, where engineers occasionally used it as a heavy load for bridge and road surface testing. Over time, even that work faded away. Funding dried up, and this one-of-a-kind turretless tank was quietly forgotten about. By the early 1950s, the tank had completely dropped off the military's radar. Nobody knew where it was or what shape it was in. Paperwork got shuffled around, commanding officers rotated out, and all the post-war reshuffling of the military meant records just got lost all over the place. The absolutely wild part of this whole situation? This wasn't some small part or a box of spare bolts that went missing. It was a nearly 100-ton armored vehicle measuring over 36 feet long. And somehow, the people who were supposed to keep track of it just completely lost it. When historians and museum people tried to figure out what happened to it over the years, they got absolutely nowhere. Official archives had nothing on whether the tank had been scrapped or relocated somewhere else. Most experts figured it had probably been cut up for scrap years ago, so there was no real point in searching anymore. It really seemed like the story of the super heavy tank was done for good, and nearly 30 years went by with no new information. By the mid-70s, this oddball project was remembered only by a handful of armor enthusiasts and military historians. Then in 1974, Army Reserve magazine ran an interesting piece. The editors printed an old black and white photo of a mysterious turretless armored vehicle and challenged their readers to identify it. It was basically a fun little trivia game for military buffs to test their hardware knowledge. The editors expected maybe a handful of correct answers in the mail and figured that would be the end of it. One of the letters they got back had way more than just a name. It was written by an Army Reserve captain stationed at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. He correctly identified the T-28 super heavy tank in the photo, but then dropped a bombshell. According to him, the vehicle was sitting right there on his base. The tank was parked out at a night vision testing range, completely overgrown with brush and hidden under a camo net. For all those years, this piece of armor had just been sitting in the middle of a training field, and nobody had ever thought to ask where it came from. The magazine editors contacted the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, which was all about preserving historic American military vehicles. At first, the museum staff were pretty skeptical about the whole thing. They were pretty sure the prototype had been scrapped ages ago, so either the captain was confused or someone was messing with them. But the captain stood his ground and offered to send evidence. When the experts saw photographs of the overgrown tank, all doubt vanished. The pictures clearly showed the vehicle's signature low profile, its 4 sets of tracks, and the massive gun mount on the front of the hull. The vehicle turned out to be the exact same lost prototype that researchers had long assumed was destroyed. The news blew up in the military history community. This unique machine, the only one of its kind in existence, had spent nearly 3 decades sitting outside in the open at a forgotten proving ground. And somehow, after sitting out in the weather for all those years, it was still in decent enough shape to fix up. The Patton Museum wasted no time and put together a recovery team to go get it. Getting a 100-ton tank out of the bushes and hauling it back to Fort Knox was no small feat. But they pulled it off, and the super heavy tank found a permanent home in the museum. It stayed there until 2011, when the Patton Museum administration started relocating its entire collection to a new site. Transport teams moved the tank to Fort Moore in Georgia, formerly known as Fort Benning, where it still sits today on the grounds of the National Armor and Cavalry Collection at the Armor Training Center. You can actually go there and see the heaviest American tank from World War II up close. In the end, this vehicle never fired a single shot in combat. It became famous mostly because of its ridiculously slow speed, vanished from Army records for 3 full decades, and was eventually rediscovered thanks to a random photo in a magazine. And that's the full story of the T-28 super heavy tank. From drawing board to battlefield reject to museum exhibit,